I'm telling you, Mr. Malkovich, you'd be the perfect choice to play Elroy in an adaptation of Love Me, Face and Danger. Okay, I'll talk to your agent. I've got to go, I'm doing a show. Bye. Hello, and welcome to Elroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book which was very important in James Elroy's life, one that he enjoyed reading, that it thrilled him, moved him, inspired him, maybe even revolted him, but nevertheless, it's been an important book for James Elroy. We've done a number of great novels, hard-boiled novels, and also some literary novels during this show, but today we are going back to non-fiction, and we're going back to one of the greatest all-time Hollywood memoirs, and that is Elia Kazan, A Life. Yes, Elia Kazan was a director, actor, handyman, writer, informer. He led several lives, and in his 800-page memoir, he went into it in great detail. Okay, so let's get into some of the background. Elia Kazan was born in Constantinople in the twilight days of the Ottoman Empire. His father was a rug merchant. They emigrated to the United States. His family did quite well. In many ways, they were the immigrant success story, and he managed to get him into Williams College and then Juilliard. Kazan describes having something of a chip on his shoulder. He was born in the Ottoman Empire, but his family was Cappadocian Greek and didn't fit in with the kind of white upper crust society he began moving in, and he subsequently worked in the group theatre, wanted to be an artist, and that's where he got his nickname Gadget, because he was always fixing the furniture, he was working on the props, he could fix the engine on a car, and Gadget got shortened to Gadge. And then he worked in 2 movies as an actor, and then turned to directing, and had a big hit with his first film, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and then subsequently had a number of hits before his career was just about to take off. In fact, one of his early films, Gentleman's Agreement, which had been an expose of anti-Semitism, had won Best Picture. His career was taking off when McCarthyism reared its ugly head in America, and Kazan was called before the House of Un-Americans Activities Committee and asked to name names. Now, Kazan had been a fellow traveller, i.e. he had been a member of the Communist Party, but not really a dedicated member. It was more like the Don Fing for him. But several members of the group theatre had been members, and ultimately he named all of them. Apparently, according to him, this is obviously an apology for informing. His original plan had been to admit his own culpability, and then with the playwright Clifford Odets, they had a pact that they would name each other and no one else. But then eventually he got sickened by the subversive nature of the Communist Party. He said he felt disgusted by it, and his plan to really infiltrate American theatres, American studios, things like that. And he wanted to bring it out into the open, so he named all the names he did. He went from being like a part-time traitor to a full-time traitor. And betrayal is one of the key themes of this book, both the political betrayal that he made and also his constant need to commit adultery, cheat on his first 2 wives, even though they loved him devoutly, especially his first wife, the playwright Molly Thatcher. But also to cheat, seduce his friends' wives, and to have these long affairs. And when this book came out in 1988, by which time Kazan was an old man, he was 78 years old, many of his old friends discovered that he'd slept with their wives, and it was Kazan is quite a vulgar man by his own admission, and there's lots of kind of, even though he was short in stature and not particularly handsome, there's lots of kind of almost territorial claims on women, which are rather unsavory, I must admit. But anyway, moving on. After his testimony, he gets shunned by a lot of Hollywood. He loses a lot of friends, including His friendships come under strain with people like Bud Schulberg, Arthur Miller, and Tennessee Williams. Nevertheless, a lot of his friendships do survive despite the poison pen letters he receives. And even though he loses out on some work, he then goes on to the most successful films of his career. Now, he directed A Streetcar Named Desire on stage, Death of a Salesman, many of the great plays on stage, and subsequently did A Streetcar Named Desire, the film On the Waterfront, which is another apology for an informer. And many of his great films, East of Eden, Splendor in the Grass, I think from Elroy's perspective, the films that really touched him, having spoken to him about it as his biographer, would be the classic film noir Panic in the Streets, which is very interesting today because it's about a virus outbreak in New Orleans and attempts to contain it. Unfortunately, compared to COVID-19, it feels like a feel-good film because ultimately the virus is contained. Kazan worked a lot with the public authorities, like the Public Health Authority in New Orleans at the time. It's got a documentary film feel about it. And as well, as Kazan said, I'm not very good at directing spectacle, I'm not very good at directing action scenes. Well, if you watch Panic in the Streets, you'd have to disagree with him. It ends with one of the all-time great chases. Jack Palance playing a mobster. And it was his film debut, and a wonderfully exhilarating chase scene in which Palance, who really had the physique of an athlete, is tested to the limit. And it is a fantastic film noir. And then subsequently as well, A Face in the Crowd, which is about this kind of oaky character who becomes a media sensation. He's plucked out of jail, and he becomes the media darling at the time. He gets involved in politics, and that was really about the advent of television and a warning as to where television was going. Of course, Kazan, when he was writing his memoir, says that now it feels like it was prophesizing Reagan. It might also be prophesizing Trump, and not so much television, but also the internet, and how the internet is a godsend to demagogues. Anyway, by the mid-60s, Kazan's film career was finally running out of steam, and it feels like there'd been a flip in that many of the writers and the actors who he'd named in his testimony who'd had their careers destroyed, that they were making comebacks. The Blacklist, McCarthy was dead, the Blacklist had kind of died with him. And the people who testified, people like Edward G. Robinson and Kazan himself, they were finding it difficult to get work. So there really was a kind of karmic justice at play. But Kazan he had a talent that's very, very hard to keep down. And he turned to writing. And his first novel, The Arrangement, his first original novel, was a huge bestseller and was on the New York Times bestseller list for many, many weeks. It's out of print today. It went out of print in the 1980s, partly because Kazan made a rather very, very bad film of it. And he turned to writing. None of his other novels were anywhere near as successful. They were all out of print. The only other book of note he wrote was this memoir. And it's very, very interesting, and it features many direct addresses to the reader. So when he's talking about his testimony, he's like, what would you do, dear reader, if you were in the kind of dilemma I was in? When he's talking about his infidelities, not just during his first marriage, Molly sadly died of a brain hemorrhage, and then he married one of his mistresses who he'd had an illegitimate child with. That was Barbara Loden, who bore a striking resemblance to Marilyn Monroe, who he'd also had a long-standing affair with. And he was unfaithful for her too. And he's like, well, dear reader, you know what it's like, the pressures of an artist or the temptations that are put on you in the show business world. So there's lots of kind of aggressive, part moralizing, part apology, attempts, and it's interesting. His penultimate film, The Visitors, which was self-financed because he was finding it difficult to get work in Hollywood. By this stage, it was 1972. Is another apology for an informer, and this was partly based on a rape case during the Vietnam War, where a man informed on his colleagues in the army, and that was also that incident was also turned into a film by Brian De Palma, Casualties of War. So it was interesting to read this because it sparked some memories of my own. When I was a kid, I got crazy into film, including all of the kind of Hollywood canon, all the great directors, John Ford, subsequently Martin Scorsese, a protege of Kazan. And I remember vividly, I would watch the Oscars as a kid and go to a friend's house who had a satellite dish, because we didn't have one. I sound a bit like Rishi Sunak, but we didn't have Sky TV, and the Oscars were on Sky. And it was the year in the late 90s where Elia Kazan was awarded an honorary Oscar, and I remember watching it and feeling kind of embarrassed. It's difficult to watch because he comes on stage and he gets standing ovations from some people in the crowd, including like Warren Beatty, whose career he launched in Splendor in the Grass. His Kazan's technique was to get this very, very emotional intimacy with his actors and to get great, great performances. Method acting, really, Stanislavski and the Actors Studio, which he helped found. So some people whose career he launched were applauding, and other people were just sitting on their hands. And it was very, very controversial. And the honorary Oscar was given to him by Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, both of whom he'd worked with. And they looked very, very sheepish about it. I rewatched it again recently. It's actually an excruciating piece of footage. And today, it just wouldn't happen. This was before cancel culture, where controversy surrounding you as an artist could almost help you in a way, because it just made you interesting. It made you to be an agitator was quite interesting. But today, if it was announced that Elia Kazan was to be given an honorary Oscar, he's passed away now, but somebody like him, today people would write in, they'd cause a storm, they'd say this made me feel unsafe, and the Oscars would rescind it, the award, they'd issue an apology, and they put their ethical guidelines under review. It just wouldn't happen. But back then, for people who disagreed with it, it was just tough. Now, I'm not saying one way's right, one way's wrong. I'm not giving an opinion either way. I'm just saying it's a quarter of a century has passed, and times have changed. But ELLROY really admired Kazan, and not just a number of his films, but also his philosophy as an artist, because yes, ELLROY is part of that generation where it's good to be controversial. He is the demon dog. He has a very black sense of humor. He loves to provoke. He's the Asian provocateur. And there's a passage in this that really made me think of ELLROY. This is Kazan talking about his own persona as an artist. I've acquired contradictory reputations over the years. Aloof and social, secretive but open-faced, agreeable or cantankerous, concerned, indifferent, generous, cheap, given to unannounced appearances and to sudden disappearances. The reputation I'd rather not have picked up is for being a betrayer of trust. I haven't liked that. I believe it unjust. But there are reasons for it. Like many of you, I've worn the friendship mask. I often look friendlier than I feel, but then, when I have what I sought, the mask would clatter to the ground, and what I truly am would be revealed. From time to time, I do what no one is prepared for. Then someone is hurt or insulted or abandoned or simply puzzled. I let people come skin close until they trust me entirely and feel sure that I like them. But when the need is eased, the production opened, the seduction completed, I back away, suddenly become cool and remote. And those I've lured close don't know what happened. For years I've declared myself an ardent liberal in politics, made all the popular declarations of faith, but the truth was, and is, that I am, like most of you, a bourgeois. I go along disarming people, but when it gets to a crunch, I am revealed to be a person interested only in what most artists are interested in, himself. I come on as a guy you can trust, but I'm just an ordinary, searching, surviving, get-along-nick who doesn't like to be crossed, never forgives an insult, and despite the ready smile, is angry a lot of the time, or at least looks angry, for reasons that are never quite clear. So I can't blame people for what they think about me. And that's pretty much ELLROY. He told me about his constant urge, almost an addiction. He's an addictive person. He's been in rehab for alcohol and drug abuse. but there's some addictions that you can't cure. The addiction of the artist to constantly reinvent himself, often at the cost of relationships. And that's where Elroy and I differ, although I can be kind of charming and disarming myself. I don't have that killer instinct. You know, relationships are important to me, and I've always felt the need to sustain them unless they come to a natural end. You know, maybe I'm less of the artist in that regard, and I guess I'm more comfortable with that, just as Elroy and Kazan and people like that are much more comfortable with this constant need to reinvent themselves, and perhaps in Kazan's terms, the constant need to betrayal in the bedroom, but betrayal politically, betrayal artistically, and betrayal of friends. Okay, I want to do. Okay, there's a few more links between the Kazan family and Elroy, and then I'll get on to a little postscript. Um, the Kazan family, as children and grandchildren, are very active in the arts today. You know, Zoe Kazan, Maya Kazan, you know, wonderful, wonderful artists. And Nick Kazan and Chris Kazan, his sons, did an adaptation, a screenplay adaptation of The Big Nowhere, which would be absolutely wonderful on screen. Unfortunately, we're never going to see it because the rights to The Big Nowhere, Elroy's novel, are owned outright by an Italian producer who refuses to either make it or pass them along to someone who would make it. So it'd be a miracle if we ever saw that on screen. Another link is that Kazan's novels were published by Sol Stein, a publisher whose son, Jeff Stein, is a director, predominantly of music videos and music documentaries, but some feature films as well. He did the Who documentary, The Kids Are Alright, and I spoke to him when I was writing James Elroy's biography. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy, Jeff Stein. Has a real lust for life. And he became close to Elroy because Jeff Stein was going to do an adaptation of Dick Contino's Blues, Elroy's novella, and that would have been wonderful on screen. Jeff Stein worked on it for years. He worked on it. It was a Freeman production. It was going to be Jeff Stein directing, Tony Dennison starring, Tony Dennison, the actor who's in Crime Story, and Daryl Fetty writing. Daryl Fetty wrote the big hit TV show Hatfields and McCoys. He's actually descended from the Hatfields and the McCoys. He's of mixed blood of them. And the three of those guys were absolutely wonderful. Probably my favourite trio of guys. You know, my holy trinity would be Jeff Stein, Daryl Fetty, and Tony Dennison. They're wonderful guys. They worked on that adaptation for years, and sadly it never happened. That's Hollywood for you. So yeah, so there's a number of direct connections between Elroy and Kazan, but importantly, a postscript, I feel obliged to say. When Harvey Weinstein was being arraigned in New York on charges of rape and sexual assault, he was pictured going into a New York police station clutching a biography of Elia Kazan. And the actress and writer Carol Drinkwater was watching this on television. It sparked a chain reaction of memories in her because she had been up for the female lead in Elia Kazan's last film, The Last Tycoon, an adaptation of the unfinished F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. And she was pretty much guaranteed by Sam Spiegel and Harold Pinter, that who adapted it, that she was perfect for the part, and the part was hers. And then Elia Kazan was directing. He flew in to London from America, and he said he wanted to read with her personally. And she met him in a hotel room, and right away he started assaulting her. He started jumping on her, pinning her against the wall, sexually assaulting her. It stopped short of rape because he was a little guy. She's stronger than him. She managed to beat him back, push him away. She tried to get along with the read, and she tried to say, no, I'm not interested, let's do the reading. He kept trying to assault her. She kept fighting him off. She's a very brave woman, very strong. And then at the screen test the following day, Spiegel and Pinto were present, and they didn't know anything about this assault. She tried to tell them, but Kazan kept her on a very tight leash and kept humiliating her, kept aggressively browbeating her, and the screen test went awful. Spiegel later said that he destroyed it because he didn't want to damage her career. She didn't get the part. The part went to a model who was considered a bit of a disaster in the role. The film bombed. It starred Jack Nicholson, Robert De Niro, Robert Mitchum, Tony Curtis had this all-star cast, but it bombed because I never directed again. It was such a disaster. And she later told Spiegel about what happened, and he kind of rolled his eyes. He was just like, sorry, casting couch, that's part of the business. This was the mid-1970s. But fortunately, she did go on to a very strong career. She became a star on British television in All Creatures Great and Small, and then she went on to become an acclaimed writer herself. And she wrote a novel, The Lost Girl, about the incident. So I feel morally obligated to say, to dedicate this episode of Oral Reads to Carol Drinkwater and all the strong women who've come forward and spoken up for women's rights in the Me Too movement. And I just have to repeat, the constant talk of sexual conquests in this book is embarrassing. It's excruciating, particularly because I'd read Carol Drinkwater's account of what happened. The talk of one-night stands in hotel rooms and on car seats is particularly bad. Some of the talk about the long extramarital affairs is a bit more interesting with Marilyn Monroe and Constant Dowling, because those were actually relationships. These were women who actually meant something to Kazan. So yes, Kazan continues to be controversial. A lot of his great achievements now have died out. Not the films. I think the films mostly hold up, but like, where's Hollywood going? I think Hollywood is dying. He thought it was dead in the 80s. He refused to go back. And it's particularly dying today because why would you need method acting when the only films are being produced are the superhero films? It's very, very hard to apply Stanislavski to people who are genetically mutated from spiders or superheroes or whatever it is. But anyway, thank you very much for watching me talk about Elia Kazan alive. In the next episode of Our Reads, I'll be returning to more hard-boiled territory. So I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, goodbye. I've got a phone call to make. I've got to call Hollywood myself. Okay, Malkovich.